I'm Robert Hunter. I've been in and out of government now for half a century, mostly out, sometimes in. I worked for Lyndon Johnson on education in the White House. Back at the beginning of the Vietnam War, I worked in Jimmy Carter's National Security Council for 4 years, less 2 hours and 20 minutes, 2 years in charge of West Europe, 2 years in charge of Middle East. Worked for Teddy Kennedy on the Hill for 3.5 years. Great experience. And then I had the good fortune to be United States Ambassador to NATO. It's called Permanent Representative on the North Atlantic Council from July of 1993 to New Year's Day 1998. The story I'm about to tell is something that relates to one of the deep tragedies of our particular era, which was the war in Bosnia, which, as people will know, began in 1992 and went on for more than 3 years, during which time more than 200,000 people died. Now, one of the objects under American leadership at NATO was to try to get the use of NATO air power to stop the fighting. That meant mostly air power against the Bosnian Serbs, because quite frankly, they were the aggressors, sometimes against the Croats, Bosnian Croats, and most of the time against the Bosnian Muslims. This was the worst fighting in Europe since the end of World War II. And episodically, people became concerned about it, but unfortunately episodically, because it was understood at the beginning, no matter how bad things got in Sarajevo, you weren't going to have World War III. Everybody was going to stand off. Well, all right. NATO had 2 or 3 different ways of trying to use air power. Most important was the protection of so-called safe areas, which was a circle of 25 kilometers around key cities in Bosnia. Sarajevo being the most important, and where most of the casualties took place, with so-called Sniper Alley, where the Bosnian Serbs would set up on the mountainside and shell into the city, and people would have to run back and forth what they call Sniper Alley to the shell that was the Holiday Inn, which had been blown to pieces. Well, this went on until 1995. Every time I would negotiate at NATO an agreement, twisting arms, with some allies were worried because they had troops on the ground with UNPROFOR, and they didn't want them to become hostages, something that did happen in May of 1995, where the Serbs grabbed some of these UNPROFOR people and chained them to towers which might get attacked. So people were kind of skittish. We also had the French, who really weren't quite sure they wanted to go along with this. The Canadians, who worried always because they had more troops on the ground than they had anywhere else in the world. And the British, for some reason, which I never figured out, the British fought us tooth and nail on every single airstrike decision. Well, then a couple things happened. Number one, we were remodeling NATO for the post-Cold War era. We got the Americans in permanently. We finished the German problem from 1871, finally. We took the Central European countries off the diplomatic chessboard with Partnership for Peace. We were reaching out to Ukraine and then reaching out to Russia. George H.W. Bush, who came before Clinton, had this fantastic grand strategy to try to create a Europe whole and free and at peace. Well, we'd more or less done that. Well, at that point, people said, well, we've got something to protect here. But we have this war going on in Bosnia, the worst killing in Europe since World War II. How can we justify, how can we make NATO work if this is going on? Well, that was step one. Step two was the real tragedy, which was at a place called Srebrenica. I had the Canadian ambassador come to see me at one point. He said, look, we've got some folks down there in this region, and we're hearing the following reports about slaughter. I went back to Washington. The intelligence agencies got out their photo files, and they looked, and they could see it was an area which had been just an ordinary field, and now you could see it was a plowed field. Well, our UN ambassador got up in New York and was able to reveal the slaughter that had gone on. We now know that there were 8,000 men and boys that were taken out and just shot in the back of the neck the way the Nazis used to do. Well, at that point, even the British had to agree that we were going to be able to drop bombs. The UN Secretary General agreed that he would turn his key. He'd been reluctant because he'd always known that the French were reluctant and the British hated it. And they were on permanent members of the Security Council. In fact, at one point, Boutros Boutros-Ghali said to Manfred Werner, who'd been the Secretary General of NATO, "Some of your allies speak with forked tongue." Well, we all get that reference. Well, okay, so here we are in a situation where finally we're going to be able to use air power. And I get an instruction from Washington about going into a session of the North Atlantic Council, 16 allies sitting around the table, but everybody wanted to get it right because at this point, our folks were going to be put at risk on the ground as well as aircraft. So I had to negotiate this. It was a meeting that went on to about 3 or 4 in the morning. And it's not that shows that NATO's in trouble. It shows that NATO's working. Everybody wants to get it right. Well, I got an instruction from Washington that said the following. Set the rules of engagement up so that even if UNPROFOR forces are taken hostage, the bombing won't stop. And I looked at that and I said, come on. What happens, people in Washington send ambassadors instructions, and they say, well, that takes care of that. They don't actually have to do it. So I'm sitting there saying, how do I get that done? Because I'm going to look like a proper Charlie. We don't have anybody on the ground. Our people won't get taken hostage. So as it got on to 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, I was trying all kinds of things. Then I said, Mr. Secretary General, I have another thing to propose. And the instant I said it, I knew I was in trouble. And the proposal was this, that if indeed there were a situation like that, before the bombing could be halted, the NATO bombing could be halted, the decision would have to come back to us at the North Atlantic Council. Well, obviously, as I understood instantly, that meant the United States would have a veto. We could stop the stopping of the bombing. Everybody else thought that way, and at that moment, a forest of hands went up. And for the next 3/4 of an hour, I got personally denounced by every single country that had troops on the ground, and a lot of others, including the Secretary General, beating up on the United States, and I just happened to be the guy on the spot. Okay, and I want to crawl under the table, because I know I'd made this big mistake, though it was to follow the instructions that I'd been given by these proper Charlies back in Washington who didn't know how to do it. And finally, after 45 minutes, there was a great intaking of breath. Everybody stopped, and then they agreed. And I said, how'd that happen? And what finally occurred to me, they were sick and tired of the United States, the 800-pound gorilla at NATO, where everybody relied upon the United States for their security, which had been telling them what to do without any risk to Americans. They got it off their chest, and having got it off their chest, they agreed. And I sat there and I said, gosh, I guess I was pretty brilliant after all. The next day, the bombing started. Went on for 18 days. Milosevic caved in. The war came to an end. And then they went to Dayton and cleaned things up and helped to rescue Milosevic from a total defeat. But the war was over. And we did it in 18 days.